Okay, good evening, everybody. Welcome to Faculty Pub Night. My name is Rhonda Rosen. I'm the Programming and Exhibitions Librarian here at the William H. Hannon Library. On behalf of our entire team, Carol is here, John is here. We welcome you to our first in-person Faculty Pub Night since March 2020, and we're so happy to actually see people. Yay! So tonight we welcome Professor Rebecca Delfino, who is a clinical professor of law at LMU's Loyola Law School. She will be discussing her recent publications, the Prescription Abuse Prevention Act, a new federal statute to criminalize overprescribing opioids, and a new prescription for the opioid epidemic, 360-degree accountability for pharmaceutical companies and their executives, which I say yay. So a little housekeeping before we begin. Faculty Pub Night, as it's titled, is not just for faculty. And as you can see today, we have faculty, staff, and students here today. And thank you for coming, all of you. Also note that we have a buffet here. It is a lovely array of food and drink. So if you get hungry or thirsty during the presentation, you are more than welcome to get up, grab something, and come back to your seat. Also, we do use the word pub seriously, as you can see by our wine bar and beer bar. But as any good pub, we do check IDs. So on your chairs, please note that there was a small white feedback. Chris? Oh, that's your job always. Thank you, Nicole.
Nicole is stepping in for me.
Thank you very much. If you would fill that out before you leave tonight, that always helps us for future programming events. Feedback is always good. And if you include your email address, you will be entered into a raffle for a $100 Amazon gift card. So we will have a Q&A segment at the end of the presentation. So if you have any questions, please hold them till then. And we will be recording this presentation, and it will be available on the Hannon Library's YouTube channel. So it is also our privilege to do a land acknowledgement. So let's just take a moment to note that we welcome our guests onto land that is not ours. We sit tonight on the unceded lands of the Gabrielino Tongva peoples, who in the face of ongoing settler colonialism, continue to claim their place and act as steward of their ancestral lands as they have for the past 8,000 years. These lands reach from the Pacific Ocean, where we stand today, well into what is now San Bernardino County. The whole of the Los Angeles Basin is unceded territory. I would ask you all to take a moment and spend some time thinking about what it would mean to take responsibility for one's presence on stolen land. And I also encourage you to learn more about the history of the land where you sit by going to native-land.ca. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Dr. Sandy Buhai, who is going to introduce tonight's speaker. Dr. Buhai is a clinical professor and director of the Public Interest Law Department at Loyola Law School. She has over 30 years of experience teaching law, focused mainly on professional responsibility. Formerly, she was the executive director of the Disability Rights Legal Center and a deputy attorney general for the state of California. She graduated with a BA from UCLA and a JD cum laude from Loyola Law School. She has published many law review articles in the areas of clinical legal education, disability rights, civil rights, and professional responsibility. She's provided many hours of community service, including serving on the California State Bar's Committee on Professional Responsibility and Competence on the American Association of Law Schools section on pro bono and public service opportunities and the section on professional responsibility. So I welcome Dr. Sandy Buhai and a fellow Encinian.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I know some of you. Nice to see you. So it's really my great pleasure and really an honor to be here to introduce Professor Rebecca Delfino. You know, I've been lucky enough to be her colleague for the past about 20 years. And the thing that's so amazing about Professor Delfino, well, there's lots of things, and I can't spend enough time because we'll never get to her talk if I said them all. But she cares really deeply, not only about our students, but about the world that they live in. And so her research and her scholarship really centers on looking at the intersection between law and current events or current emergencies, like the opioid epidemic, like deep fakes and other AI technology, like the immigration crisis. And, you know, it's the idea of looking at the historical roots from where these events come from, and then projecting forward to figure out how we can use law, how law can and should provide solutions to these really terrible problems and potential catastrophes. Professor Delfino writes that she believes that the answers to societal challenges appear only through active intellectual engagement, and that it has to cross the disciplines between law and other disciplines. So her scholarship talks about the connections between the fields of law and business and social science and humanities and natural and applied sciences. But, you know, in addition to really providing first-class scholarship in very highly expected law reviews, she also teaches tons of courses at the law school. The dean said to me the other day that Professor Delfino could teach anything and be better than most. And it's true. I mean, it's really kind of discouraging sometimes when you see these student evaluations and, you know, the top is 5 and it's just, all she gets is 5s. It's sort of like, okay, there must be something you didn't do perfectly at. She teaches classes like appellate advocacy, criminal and civil procedure, classes talking about the judicial branch and how they operate, which is something she knows really well. Legal writing, but advanced legal writing, not just the basic stuff, because, you know, she's way past that. She also serves as our externship director. So she's the faculty director of our externship department. And she also is the faculty director of our moot court program. Now, Loyola is very proud of its moot court programs. It's been nationally recognized. They've won a ton of competitions, but only in the last few years when Rebecca took over. So it's really kind of amazing. She developed a special program that she teaches in the summer called the Moot Court Boot Camp. And I think it probably is like boot camp. Having never been, I don't know. But from what students tell me, you really work hard, but you learn, and that's how you become one of these award-winning, nationally recognized moot court programs. So as you can tell, she's got an amazing amount of energy. Her experience prior to teaching law school is really vast and varied as well. So before she joined our full-time faculty, she was the lead senior appellate attorney at the California Court of Appeal. So for those law students in the room, you know, that means she wrote a whole bunch of opinions, but we're not supposed to say that. So instead we say she wrote 500 bench memorandum and draft legal opinions in all areas of law: criminal law, civil litigation, family law, probate, dependency, juvenile delinquency. I mean, you name it. And I do think this is one of the reasons she can teach any class, because she sort of knows every area of law. She also serves as a mediator, judge pro tem for the LA County Superior Court. She presided over more than 100 limited civil arbitrations and small claims trials. She clerked at the Nevada Supreme Court. She was a lawyer at a couple of different big firms, handled all phases of civil litigation, really complex stuff. So, and then even before that, she was a teacher. She taught at LA Unified Elementary School. Can you imagine her with a bunch of little kids running around? You have to have energy for that. And then she even taught at the community colleges, teaching government and politics. So as I said, I'm not going to talk longer, but I could. And so afterwards, if you want to talk to me, I'm happy to. But I think we're really lucky to have such a dedicated and amazing scholar and teacher.
Thank you, Sandy. It's amazing because I'm only 15. Thank you so much. That was lovely. It's so nice to see so many of you here tonight. I was so honored to be invited to participate in the faculty pub night, but I was particularly thrilled that when I got the opportunity to do it in person, that I could and was willing to come out here to talk about a subject that I think is really important. And in fact, the opioid epidemic, it's ironic. I'm talking about the opioid epidemic kind of while we're still in another epidemic. There's a lot of connections between the opioid epidemic in terms of key players, doctors, pharmaceutical companies, numbers of people who've passed away and who are sick, destruction to our economy. There's a lot of connections. And so it's really exciting for me to be able to bring in-person accountability to this epidemic that is kind of laid low in the last 18 months, but it's not going away, which we'll talk about in a moment. So the first thing I want to talk about is like how I came to this subject. So Sandy mentioned that I worked at the California Court of Appeal, and having spent so many years there, I spent a lot of time and still do following what happens at our appellate court system, in part because California is a bellwether, right? What happens in California in the law, and really many of our other industries, starts to spread and happen everywhere. And so I follow California law very closely. I follow the courts, I follow case law. And a couple of years ago, I was sort of looking through case law, and I came across a case, People versus Lisa Singh. And I was reading it and I thought, well, what is this? This is a case about a doctor who had a small, well, now we would have called it a pill mill, but it was a small operation that she and her husband ran. She was a GP. He had some other, I think he was an internist, out of Rowland Heights, Chinese community. But somehow she found herself arrested and charged with 3 counts of second-degree murder, right, in connection with her prescribing practices. So I'm reading this opinion saying, wow, second-degree murder. I mean, even Dr. Murray was in charge of second-degree murder, and he killed Michael Jackson. That's crazy, right? So I'm reading this and learning about what she did, and so what her practice involved and why she sort of got onto the radar of the authorities was that in this strip mall, you would see in front of her office, there would be a line around the block of people waiting to get in all day, morning, noon, and night, and they would wait hours. And the community who came to see her were not the local community. The community who came to see her were predominantly white males between 24 and 54 who drove from hundreds of miles away to go and see this doctor. Very strange, very odd, right? You'd go into, I guess, into her clinic and you'd see it sort of looked like there were people semi-passed out and other people super agitated and amped up. She would call them into her examination room 3 at a time. I don't know about you, but when I go to the doctor, I don't want anyone else in the examination room with me, 3 at a time, and talk to them for about 10 minutes each. What's your issue? What's your issue? What's your issue? She'd take a little bit of notes, but not a ton. And they would walk out with prescriptions for Oxycodone or some other Xanax, Valium, all types of controlled substances. They would walk out, and her operation made about $3,000 a day. She and her husband, all cash, right? Very few records. She gets arrested. She gets charged because, lo and behold, 11 of her patients die of overdoses. Now, they only charged her with 3, in part because these kinds of cases are super hard to prove. And often the people who passed away had a myriad of other drugs in their system. And so the prosecution felt, I believe, that they could go forward with 3. They went forward with 3. She was convicted. She got 30 years to life in prison. Now, what caught my eye about this case, because you're like, that didn't catch your eye. What caught my eye about this case was, number one, the charges, second-degree murder, implied malice murder, but also that it said this in the opinion, it was the first time in American history that a doctor had been convicted of second-degree murder. And I thought, how could this be? Because I had been reading, this is 2018, I'd been reading about pills, mills, and prosecutions all over the country. And how could this be? This is the first time. So, of course, I started digging and sort of exploring this issue. And lo and behold, it was correct. This was the first time. And I wanted to know why. Why is it that the law, the FDA, the DEA, the state of California, the medical licensing board, all these people that are supposed to protect us, where have they been? How did this happen? So that's how I came to do this project, to start thinking about it. So what I wanted to talk a little bit with you about is like, what is the scope of the epidemic? What has it been? What's its trajectory? Where is it now? How did we get here? How did this happen? And finally, where do we go from here? And that's some of where my proposals come in my scholarship. So in terms of the scope of the pandemic, lots of figures up here. The main one is between 1999, which is when Oxycontin was first introduced in a large way to non-cancer patients, to 2019, there have been 750,000 deaths, overdose deaths, connected to at least the starting drug was a prescription opioid. Now, there's lots of, I know this seems really distracting, but I wanted to point out two things that I thought were interesting. And this is for the year 1999, right? 1999, 1.6 million people misused a prescription of some sort. That's a lot of people. 10.1 million people had misused an opioid prescription in that year. That's an amazing statistic if you think about it, but there are more. Now, fast forward, I said 750,000 lives lost by 2019. Now the epidemic that we all been living with for the last 18 months. Now we're up close to 1 million people. Everything that has made the last 18 months really hard for us. If you're a person that has opioid use disorder, or you have mental health issues, or you have addiction issues, all of those are ramped up because of the isolation, because of the distancing, because of the lack of availability to emotional and mental support. So folks that were on the edge of being in crisis with opioids, they've gone over the top. So what we see is we went from about 130 people dying a day from some kind of a opioid overdose to now, today, 140 people have died. 70% of those deaths involve a prescription opioid. It's either with what the person died of or what they started with and ended up. And you can see these startling numbers. See, you can see the progression from 1999 to 2020, right? And this is between the lockdown in November 2020 and the end of the year, 50,000 people died of overdoses. And it has continued into 2021 and beyond. So when you think about the connection to the pandemic, COVID-19, you see that the numbers are about equal in terms of Americans who have passed away. And it's truly startling. Other facts, right? How much does it cost our country? $1 trillion. That's a lot of money. Now, when you look at that a little bit closer, and these statistics are from JAMA and from Pew, we're now edging up towards $1.5 trillion, representing not only people who have died, so people who've lost family members who have lost that future income, but other people who can no longer work because they have opioid use disorders or other associated disorders. In terms of healthcare costs, $35 billion, $15 billion in criminal justice costs, nearly $100 billion on lost productivity. That is a lot of money. Of course, it's dwarfed by COVID-19, but still, this is a human-made crisis. COVID-19, not so much. So it's been a huge expense of human life, human treasure, human effort, losses to families, losses to individuals, futures that we'll never get back. So in terms of the crisis itself, it's had these waves, right? So the first wave of the crisis was, of course, created by prescription opioids. And that is this is the light blue line. The opioid deaths starting in 1999 were all from prescriptions. The second wave, when doctors stopped prescribing to as many people, folks who were addicted to opioids turned to heroin. So that's the second wave, right? And that wave you can see beginning, and this is the slightly darker line, that begins in about 2010, because that's the first time doctors realized maybe we shouldn't be giving these prescriptions. And then the third wave that we're still in now is fentanyl. These are all opium-based narcotics. And so starting with a prescription that you are no longer having access to leads to heroin, fentanyl, and other varieties. So we are in the midst of three waves, and it all started with sadly with prescriptions. sadly, in doctors' offices. In terms of the scope, sometimes people will ask me, well, who does this affect? This doesn't really affect everyone, but that's absolutely wrong. It has affected every single state. It has affected every single demographic. It has impacted nearly every family if you dig deeply enough. And remember, this is a recent phenomenon. Before 1999, this didn't really happen. So this is only in the last a little over 20 years. So what we know about the statistics of who it affects is that the vast majority, not all, but the vast majority of folks who suffer from opioid use disorder or have died as a result of the opioid epidemic are non-Hispanic white Americans, 75%. We can talk about why it's hit white Americans so sharply, where Black Americans and Hispanic Americans and other folks is roughly 13%, 9%, and 5%. So it is a epidemic in terms of death that has mostly affected white Americans. Really interesting. More men than women, more non-college educated than college educated. As I mentioned before, the demographic that has been the hardest hit are 24 to 54-year-olds. And in terms of profession, veterans. Veterans per capita suffer from opioid use disorder and have suffered the most fatalities from the opioid epidemic. But it has hit every community, right? So it has it doesn't ignore anyone in the way that the COVID-19 pandemic has hit everyone. It doesn't discriminate. If you take a prescription opioid and you become addicted, it doesn't care. It doesn't matter what your gender is, what your race is, what your belief system is. You are absolutely hooked. So it's a magnitude that I think is hard for one to fathom, but it is with us. It has always been with us, and it will continue to be with us. So moving on to, you see the scope. How did it happen? How did we get here? Well, it starts, there's the arrow starting with a beautiful opium poppy, ending all the way with the law, right? And I could also have made it in a circle because it seems in some ways like a circle. And so this is one area, Sandy mentioned, I love history. And for me, when I do research, the most interesting thing is digging into the history of how we got here and why these things happen. And so if you will indulge me, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the history of this because it's interesting. So opium, since the Neolithic period, I don't know who's the first person who figured it out, but somebody figured it out. Someone in the Middle East found this beautiful flower, split the side of it, took the milky juice, dried it, and then ingested it. And I've never tried opioids, but I understand from folks who have that the feeling, the combination of pain relief and euphoria is like nothing you've ever seen. Just amazing. And however, right, there's always two sides to a coin. On the one hand, you have this euphoria, this relief from every single pain. When it's over, the crash, what we call the dope sickness, the come down on it, is worse than any pain you had beforehand, is from what I understand. And it's highly addictive. So opium attaches to, we have receptors in our brains. They're actually called opiate receptors. They attach and they don't want to let go. And when they do let go, the explosion in neurons, the rest of your brain, causing pain, causing sickness, body aches, fever, chills, is horrifying to witness, and I believe horrifying to experience. So somewhere along the line, we figured out as human beings that we wanted to use this substance because it made us feel so good. And ever since then, we've been trying to figure out how can we use it without any downside. We're human beings. We just, you just keep on hitting your head against the wall. Why? Because it feels good when you stop. That's kind of the theory that we have with opium. So historically, for the 300 years going back, we can see that opium has played a role in nearly every major civil conflict and international conflict, beginning with the Opium Wars and all through the 1700s. You had people smoking, ingesting, eating opium, and having that experience, and then chasing the high that goes away. And it was unregulated, of course. Those were unregulated days. And at the same time, you had folks, scientists and other chemists that were trying to figure out a way to synthesize something from opium that was not addictive. That was the goal. That was entirely the goal. That's how we got morphine. 1806, morphine was developed by a German chemist. And the idea behind morphine was that it was going to be 6 times more powerful than just straight up opium powder, and yet not addictive. That was the theory of morphine. And morphine is an extremely powerful analgesic pain reliever. It became popular. In fact, it was used so commonly on the battlefields of the Civil War that, and then when the war ended, there was so much dope sickness among the soldiers that their condition was called the soldier's disease, because they were so addicted to the morphine. So it didn't work. It relieved the pain, but it still was highly addictive, and it made people appear as if they were walking zombies, again, trying to chase the high. In 1898, another German chemist, is actually working for the company that we now know as Bayer, like Bayer aspirin. He came up with heroin. Now, heroin is twice as powerful as morphine, right? So it's twice as powerful as morphine. And the theory was, well, we've isolated the molecule, it's not going to be addictive. And through a period of 1898, well into the early 1920s, heroin was advertised as by Bayer and other companies as a cure-all, pain-relieving cure-all. It was advertised for every condition from respiratory problems to headaches to menstrual cramps to crabbiness, have some heroin. It seems shocking to us now, but it was just, you would just go to the apothecary, they would mix it, they would give you the heroin, and off you went, right? But of course that led to abuse because it is addictive. It didn't work, right? Which then takes us to about 1916, oxycodone. So what is oxycodone? Again, all of these came from Germany. I'm not sure why, but in Germany in 1916, two chemists were again isolating the molecules of opium and found another type of molecule that they named oxycodone. And their advertisement was that it was 6 times more powerful than heroin, and it was also not addictive. So you hear this story about these drugs, and in fact, the preeminent scholar on the history of opium, his name is Martin Booth. He says in his book that the story of opium drugs is the story of history repeating itself, which is one of the reasons I wanted to work on this project, just to get out this idea that as much as we try to find fixes, there's never any fix without a downside. So back to oxycodone. So oxycodone is developed in Germany in 1916. Doesn't really get to the United States until after World War II. It was used in Germany. It was all the rage. It was called a miracle cure for everything in Germany during the Second World War, and it was used on the battlefield as an anesthetic and analgesic. But it didn't get to the United States at that time. In the United States, the drug of choice at the time was heroin and morphine. Oxycodone doesn't actually appear in the United States until the 1950s. And in the 1950s, there was already a concern in the United States about people that were abusing morphine, abusing heroin. And so there was some caution about using something that was a derivative. Yet, lest our drug companies avoid earning a profit, what they decided to do is they took oxycodone and they mixed it with aspirin. That gives us Percodan. Right? I know everybody's grandma took Percodan, right? And then if you mix it with acetaminophen, you get Percocet. And those were by cutting them, they weren't quite as powerful. They're addictive, but they were released as those kinds of drugs. So this development is sort of there. It's in the 50s. In the 50s and 60s, we see other addictive drugs that come up. But this is at the point in our story where enter the Sacklers. So we have 3 brothers, Raymond, Arthur, and Mortimer. They were psychiatrists by training. They went to medical school. Arthur also was a salesman, and he had a part-time job where he also worked at a pharmaceutical advertising company in the 50s. And he's literally the father of all what we know as pharmaceutical marketing. Every technique that you've ever heard about or you see in culture about, drug reps going to visit doctors, the advertising you see all the way back there. This is a Valium drug. All of this is Arthur Sackler's brainchild. And he was actually brilliant in the way that he figured out how to market and how to make people understand that they had an unmet need that some drug would help them solve. So he works for this advertising company, and then eventually he and his brothers, because they were smart, anytime they worked for a company, anytime their ads worked for a company, instead of getting paid, they would get a little bit of profit. It was like a profit, like a participation. So they ended up making a lot of money, and they bought this little tiny drug firm called Purdue Frederick, right? And Purdue Frederick's claim to fame at that time was they made earwax remover, disinfectant, and constipation medicine. That's all they did, right? It was a minor business venture. Then in the 1960s, the Sacklers, Arthur and his brothers, they land, when they're doing this advertising, they land a contract with Hoffman LaRoche for a brand new tranquilizer called Valium. Valium, right? Mother's little helper. Valium. What Arthur did is he took the techniques he had developed in the advertising firm and he applied those to the sale of Valium. And this is the first time that we see an effort to directly market to doctors, to hospitals, and to some extent to the public. So what they did, and the other thing they did is they hired a bevy of young, attractive people to go to doctors' offices and give them free samples and get them to use Valium. Valium, through these aggressive marketing tactics, became the first pharmaceutical industry's first billion-dollar drug by like 1965. What they did with their money, again, they took a little percentage from Hoffman LaRoche. So these people are billionaires before like 1965. Then what they did is they started supporting not only their philanthropic and arts endeavors that we see in many areas, but they also started supporting nonprofit organizations that were involved in the medical community. They started a medical journal, right? They started newsletters. What they basically did is they tried to make a closed circuit where they created all the advertising, they created and ran all the clinical trials, right? They created all of the science to prove the safety of their drugs. And then they directly marketed to whoever would accept it. And they convinced people that you needed these drugs because your life was drab and terrible and you felt, and you would feel better if you did. I mean, they were truly brilliant in the way that they took charge of this. But this is the 50s and the 60s, and they were mostly in Valium, and Purdue Frederick was selling earwax cleaner. So then what happens is this is Raymond Sackler's son, Arthur Sackler. He becomes the titular head of what we now think of as Purdue Pharma, because they changed the name at some point. So Purdue owned a little teeny drug company in Germany by the name of NAP, right? And NAP was working on this idea of creating a coating to do time release for different drugs. And they had come up with a drug for kidney issues. It was time release. It was really helpful because it allowed people to like be, more mobile and have regular lives and not be in the hospital and deal with these kidney issues. They came to Purdue and said, we have an idea of taking this time release thing and applying it to oxycodone, right? And the idea would be, this would be the first time that you could have a pill form morphine. A pill form morphine revolutionized healthcare. Now I know you're going, oh my God, but really in a good way. So think about yourself for a minute. Let's say that you're in stage 4 terminal cancer and you are dying and you are in tremendous, what they call breakthrough pain, more pain than a human should feel. Before MS content, you would have to be in the hospital or in a facility where you could have drip morphine. That was the only way you could have it. And your life, for whatever was remains of it, was not high quality. If you could take a pill, that would change the remainder of your life. So that was their theory. Let's see if we can do this. And that's what they decided to do. That's MS Contin. MS Contin came onto the market. They went to the FDA in 1980 and was ultimately approved by 1985. Now, MS Contin was approved to be used for breakthrough cancer pain, people who were terminally ill. And the palliative care movement that existed at that time, endorsed that. And that's the only use that it was approved for. And that seemed to be fairly effective because, as I already told you, the Oxycontin crisis, the opioid crisis, didn't begin until 1999. So you could see for a period of about 20 years, it was used successfully in a very controlled way. Now, what happened to get us to Oxycontin was, as the patent for MS Contin was going to expire, Richard Sackler said, why don't we slightly change the formulation and then also make it so that other people could take it. Chronic pain. We all have chronic pain, right? So that's how we got Oxycontin. Now, when you marry that with their aggressive marketing tactics, with the fact that they controlled the medical journals, they controlled the institutions, and they gave to medical schools, they invested in their business by sort of clearing the way so that that their drugs could be approved. So MS Contin is actually is approved by the FDA in 1995. And this is an example of their marketing, right? That it was something that lasted for 12 hours, that there was no risk of toxicity, that it was non-addictive. Take it and you'll feel fine, and soon you'll get. They did a whole campaign called "Getting Your Life Back," where they had people that gave testimonials about recovering from their pain. So you might be wondering, where is the FDA? Where is the FDA in all of this? So in terms of regulation of opioids, the very first US law was the Opioid Act of 1909. And basically that's the first law, right? That said you can't smoke opium. Don't do it. And then people did it anyway. And so in 1914, the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act was passed. And that was the first federal law that actually required a prescription. It gave birth to the notion that you can't just go to the corner and get your heroin. You have to have a doctor write you a script. It also required for the first time that pharmaceutical companies register with the government. So that's 1914. Nothing much is done in that space until the 1970s again. But in the interim, the FDA is created in 1938. And the FDA, the purpose behind the FDA was to monitor food sources and drug sources and so forth. And so they were intimately involved in all of the approval process for MS Contin and Oxycontin, et cetera. So what's interesting, though, about the FDA is the FDA started between 1938 and 1980. It was an organization that required at least 2 peer-reviewed clinical trials for any approval. Approvals took sometimes 10 years. It also required that you have package inserts that describe fully and completely all of the risks. It also required that pharmaceutical companies track who order the pharmaceuticals and who they went to. It also required that you not only had to have clinical trials before they were released, but afterwards as well. So there was a very robust, the pharmaceutical industry didn't like it, but that's how the world worked prior to 1980. 1980, Ronald Reagan becomes president. And the very first thing that he begins to do is deregulate a bunch of industries, including the pharmaceutical industry. And the theory was that the FDA has gotten in the way of business and industry, and we need to let go of all that. So what they let go of was tracking adverse drug reactions. They got rid of the requirements requiring 2 clinical trials. They also got rid of testing the labeling process, right? So by the time MS Contin and Oxycontin get to the FDA, it's not the kind of regulatory body that any one of us would want. Certainly, we wouldn't want it today. And in fact, the process of getting MS Contin approved, this is amazing. So MS Contin, they went to They went to the FDA in 1980 and they said, we want to approve this drug. And the FDA said, well, you need where you have to do some clinical trial. And they said, no, we don't, because you know what? It's just morphine, just morphine. We all know that morphine, and morphine's been around forever. It's safe. And the FDA said, okay, okay. And they said, and plus it's only for people that are dying of cancer. Don't worry about it. And so the FDA approved it. And then, right, then with Oxycontin, they came back to the FDA and they said, so we have this new thing called Oxycontin. And you don't really need to approve it because you already approved MS-Contin, which is just morphine. And they said, well, okay, but what about a clinical trial? And they said, we'll do it afterwards. Literally, you cannot make this up, right? So that's exactly what happened. And what's interesting, this is interesting for context back to the opioid, to the COVID pandemic. So you remember when we were all thought we were going to die 2 years ago, right? And it was about a year from then to when the vaccines were approved, or emergency approval. It took a year, right? And there was a hand wringing about that. Oxycontin went through this entire process of approval in less than a year. And there was no emergency. That's, I mean, this is mind blowing when you look at you look at that, and nobody blinked an eye. The other thing that was sort of interesting about the FDA, which still exists today, is that there has been a revolving door between the FDA and the pharmaceutical industry, and there is a revolving door between the Department of Justice and the pharmaceutical industry, and it's gone back and forth and back and forth. So I highlight this. This was in the Oxycontin packaging insert. Delayed absorption by OxyContin is believed to reduce abuse liability. That's just made up. It's just marketing, right? The FDA regulator who approved this, he came up with it. He sent it to Purdue, and they said, we like it, and it went in the packaging. 2 years later, he's an executive at Purdue Pharma. This played a huge role in that in-person marketing that pharmaceutical reps did with doctors. It made a huge difference. I mean, when pharmaceutical reps went to go see doctors, they basically said, this is not addictive. If you aren't already addicted to something else, this will not cause addiction. Doctors said, why? And they said, because there's a coating, time release, right? The payload of the opium, the opioid will not hit the system. It'll be graduated across time. Now, at the time, nobody had any idea, although they should have, that the pills would be crushed and people would smoke them and snort them and turn them into liquid and drink them. And the reason why I say they should have known is in the package insert, it said, be careful. If you crush this, then it's no longer delayed release. So it's like a how-to. Like, who the hell does this? It was like a how-to manual on how to create an opioid drug. So the FDA is really a part of the group that is also responsible for this. Last but not least, of course, are the doctors, which was really what my scholarship started on about, was doctors, right? So doctors are interesting people. Before 2015, there was no major medical school that had a required curriculum on pain management. Most people took one class on dispensing and went on with their career. There wasn't anything. There was no education. And to the extent there was literature, the literature that existed was produced, paid for, and written by Purdue Pharma. So doctors were kind of in this delicate position of not really knowing what to do. And at the same time that this is happening in the 80s and early 90s, there is the palliative care and the pain movement that emerged. It was a huge patients' rights movement was emerged during this time. And this notion that pain was something that is not a normal part of the human condition came into the zeitgeist. And in fact, these organizations, the American, I want to get these names right because they're kind of funny. The American Pain Society, the American Academy of Pain Medicine, and the Joint Commission on Pain, right? These seemingly, right, governmentally sounding organizations started lobbying and creating literature and pushing the Federation of State Medical Boards, who license doctors, to not only encourage, but require that all doctors actively treat pain. Makes sense, except the American Pain Medicine Society, the American Pain Academy of Pain Medicine, all of these societies were developed and funded by Purdue Pharma and the other pharmaceutical companies. So they basically were controlling everything, right? And they came up with this idea that pain was the fifth vital sign, which is sort of interesting. I don't know if you ever going to the doctor and if you've ever been asked, are you in pain? And there's like smiley faces and doing you point out. That's these people, right? There they come up with it, right? So pain was on the level of temperature, blood pressure, respiratory, and heart rate as important. Now it ignores the fact that a part of being alive is being in pain, right? Pain, it tells us there's something wrong. So the notion that we should alleviate all of it is not, I would offer, is not particularly the way that we've been designed as human beings, that there's some level of pain that we need to be feeling, but they felt there should be none. There's too much chronic pain. And there is a lot of chronic pain, but using OxyContin, MS-Contin to relieve that pain, I'm not so sure that that is particularly safe. Now, I want to show you a clip because I think this captures better than anything I could say. This is a scene from a show called Dope Sick. Yeah, there we go. And it captures, I think, really well. Yeah, it's down here. I'll get it.
That's Michael.
Yeah, Mike. All right. So that really happened. It's a great show, by the way, especially if you want to really dig into this issue. But what's interesting is I wanted to play this. So he mentions this PowerPoint way down here. I'll get it. There we go. And then there we go. Perfect. So he mentions this less than 1%. You're thinking, well, where did it come from? So this is so interesting. So in 1980, there was a gentleman by the name of Dr. Herschel Jick and his graduate student, Jane Porter. And they had done a survey of medical records, about 11,000 medical records of folks that were hospitalized patients at a hospital in Boston, who, while they were hospitalized and closely monitored by staff, were treated with opioids. And it doesn't say which opioid, it just says opioids. What they found was less than 1% actually became addicted. Now you're thinking, wow, is that peer reviewed? No. This finding was from a 5-line, 1-paragraph letter that was in the New England Journal of Medicine. This less than 1% appeared in every single ad It appeared in every single conversation with every single drug representative for all of the companies. In fact, it even appeared in Time magazine. Why? Because the FDA? I don't know. I wasn't old enough to interrogate it. But there you have it, right? You have the reliance on something that would not even laughably qualify as science today to say that it is safe. Now, I wanted to say something before I go on about he offers him a token, a drug sample. There's really interesting information about the connection between physicians and drug companies and gifts and other sort of things, inducements, if you will, to prescribe. Pharmaceutical companies still to this day spend about $5 billion annually on gifts to physicians and medical students, right, to promote their products. They buy everything from pens to lanyards, notepads, meals, tickets to entertainment, sporting events, weekend-long vacations, you name it. Doctors are human beings. Who doesn't want something that's free? And what they found when they studied the impact of this kind of infiltration on prescribing practices, they found, and this is the New England Journal of Medicine, this one's actually peer-reviewed, they said that 83% of the physicians accept food or drink from pharmaceutical companies. This is in 2008. 78% accepted drug samples, 35% accepted meeting expenses, 28 accepted money for lectures. They got paid to go on lectures, on lecture circuits. 7% accepted free tickets. A 2016 study found, and this is amazing, that a single $20 bill, $20 meal rather, for a doctor could change their prescribing habits. One $20 meal. And so what that meant for Purdue Pharma is by 2018, Purdue Pharma was spending $9 million on doctor food every year. Because, it's through the stomach and then to the prescription pad, apparently, right? So you have this situation, it's like a perfect storm, if you will, of, developing a particular drug by particular marketing techniques at the right time when the FDA isn't vigorous. And, from there, we have the epidemic. So this then takes me to, how did this happen in terms of the law? I'm a lawyer, right? So I started looking at, well, what is the law? How could this have happened? So the law that now exists after the Harrison Act is the Controlled Substances Act. And that was promulgated in the 1970s during Nixon's war on drugs. And basically what it did is it put all drugs into a schedule, 5 schedules, with Schedule 1 being the types of drugs that the government has determined should not be prescribed for any reason whatsoever. Those would include things like ecstasy, LSD, MDMA. Heroin is there now. Cannabis is there now. Remember, this is a federal law. So it's still there, right? So those are Schedule 1. You can never, Schedule 5, rather, you can never prescribe them, all the way down to, the Tylenol that you have in your pocket. That is the lowest schedule of drugs. The opioids come in at Schedule 2, right? Which means that they have therapeutic value. So that's all of the MS content, Oxycodone, morphine. They have therapeutic value in certain settings, and they can be prescribed. However, the default in the CSA is that all distribution, all manufacture, all trafficking is illegal. And the only way you can do it is if you have a license and you are doing it for a legitimate medical purpose within the usual course of professional practice. So this is the exception to the CSA that allows doctors to issue Schedule 2 prescriptions. That's great. So if that exists, why is it that Dr. Singh is such an outlier? And why is it that it seems like they're only prosecuting people for pill mills? That is because this term, legitimate medical purpose, no one knows what it means. Now, even the Supreme Court doesn't know what it means. In 2007, there was a case, Gonzalez versus Oregon, where they were trying to parse the CSA because someone wanted to use opioids for an end of life, like someone who wanted to commit suicide. It was in Oregon, right? And it went all the way up to the Supreme Court about whether that was a legitimate medical purpose. The Supreme Court said, we don't know. And not only did the Supreme Court say they didn't know, they said there was no way that the DOJ could come up with the a definition, because it really wasn't the DOJ's job to do that. And if you want a definition, I guess you go back to Congress and they give a definition. And oh, by the way, we think that the state should figure it out, right? Because states license doctors. So they punted to the states, they punted to the legislature, and they also said, and if we really can't figure out in a substantive case, they said the jury can figure it out. The jury knows what this means. Here's the problem with what it means. You may come to my office. I may have legit, you are in pain. Yeah, you're in pain. Okay, here's your script. It's legitimate. You said you're in pain. I may even know that you're going to walk out of here and divert it somewhere else. Under this standard, you can't prosecute me. You can try, but you can't. This is so uncertain that right now, this term, the last month, the Supreme Court has heard a case in which they're trying to figure out if there's some kind of a good faith exception that allows doctors to maybe avoid prosecution in some states. They don't know. They don't know. And the circuit courts are totally divided. So there is no definition. It's totally vague. And what happens when you have vague statutes is that good actors don't use drugs when they should, and bad actors throw caution to the wind and do whatever they want. That's the problem with vague laws, right? They don't provide guidance. They don't lend predictability. They make people's lives desperate and unorganized, and ultimately lead the decision of prescribing to the doctor's personal subjective view of how much they can accept risk or willing to accept risk. That's not a way to treat people in pain. If you ask me, it's just, it's crazy. So the CSA doesn't work. There are no other criminal statutes that exist. The states have this patchwork quilt. In some states, in Alabama, there is no, like, doctors can do whatever they want in Alabama. They can write as many prescriptions as they want. It is not against the law in Alabama. Alabama's taking the position that doctors can do no harm. Other states, everyone, if someone at a party dies of an addiction and you're connected to the sponsorship of that party, you might be charged under the murder-induced, drug-induced homicide statute. So there's this range. It's all over the map. And if you ask me, I'm of the view that, especially when you're dealing with a federally regulated narcotic, the law should be applied equally to everyone wherever they are. Doesn't exist. So then I went, aha, this is something for me to work on. My proposal, this is my proposal in my first piece. My proposal was to create a national response rooted in criminal federal law, a standalone statute disentangled from the CSA, which focuses on implied malice. So what do I mean by that? Well, when I studied Sang, I realized that her case, the way she was convicted for second-degree murder was they went under an implied malice theory. And what does that mean? So this is, forgive me if you already know, first, second, and manslaughter. But how it works is first-degree murder. Homicide means you intend to kill someone. I intend to kill them, right? Manslaughter is I'm criminally negligent. I don't really care. I don't really know what's happening. I don't really care. That's criminal negligence. That's manslaughter. In between, we have this thing called implied malice murder, second-degree murder, right? And what is that? That is what they call, and this makes a lot of sense, the abandoned and malignant part. What that means is I know and appreciate the risk. I understand the risk, and I don't care if someone gets hurt or they die. Right? That's second-degree murder. That's exactly what Sang was charged with, and she was convicted of. Why? Because she knew they were diverting drugs. She was warned by pharmacies. She even got a call from the state, from the medical board, and from the federal government saying, your patients are dying. And she was like, I'm making $2,000 a day, right? So that's how they got her, right? There wasn't any legitimate medical purpose because she could say, he said he had pain. If she'd been charged under the CSA, I don't know what had happened. But they went under a state law, second-degree murder theory, and she was convicted. So what I have developed is an idea to use that theory. Here's my statute, right? I've built in the word implied malice. And it is far simpler because it builds in what they actually know. They can come in and say, I had purpose X and purpose Y and purpose Z. And maybe if you're charged with both the CSA and my crime, you get out of that one. But this one, you're still held accountable for. And it's clear, right? The states, we have a hugely developed canon of criminal law on second-degree implied malice murder that can be easily adopted and applied. I also put in here where I have literally, in the language of the statute I proposed, I built in this idea of what the court found in Say's case is that she had special medical or expert knowledge of the dangerousness of the addictive properties of the drugs. She knew. And if that law existed, she could have been charged by the federal government as well as the state of California. So that is my proposal. Other ideas that I have written in that article and my follow-up article, which is about the pharmaceutical industry, is to reinvigorate the regulatory space. So all of the things that happened in the 1980s, we need to put back into place. We need to make sure that that we are publicly investing in research, in clinical trials, that the revolving door between the pharmaceutical industry and the industry is closed forever, and that we have regulations that require folks to do things such as adopt an ethical and a canon of ethics for the pharmaceutical industry. Doesn't exist. Seems to me the FDA should say, if you want to have approval of your drug, adopt this canon of ethics in terms of good behavior. So I believe that we need to work in these spaces as well as in the criminal law. The other thing that I think is really, really important in thinking about these problems with opioids is, as I told you, you start out with prescription, you go to heroin, and now you're on fentanyl, and now you're utterly addicted. You've lost your house, your family, your job. You have nothing except addiction. What do we do with those people, right? What do we do with these people? Now, what folks who have been studying this has found is the most effective treatment is called medicated assisted treatment. And this is used for folks that have the opioid use disorder, which I think is now in the DSM manual. So what is that? It is literally weaning the person off of the narcotic, replacing it with one like naloxone or one of the others that is not quite as powerful, a little bit at a time, giving them wraparound services to help them address if they have underlying mental health or emotional issues, helping people sort of literally get their lives back. It's an expensive process, right? But I was happy to say the reason I put this picture here is the CARES Act and some of the other acts and some of the other things in the Biden administration is reinvesting in these spaces, right? Which I think are really important for people to recover, right? Because there are people, the opioid crisis, about 50% of people who are suffering are still alive. And we want to keep them alive so they can be productive members of our society. And this is, I think, the best way to do that. This is my second article, which I don't have time to talk about tonight. But just so you know, my suggestion here is also to create another criminal statute based on the RICO, using RICO, criminal RICO, which is the racketeering law that's used to get the mob. You ask me, these people are mobsters. If you do any reading about the Sacklers, the whole family, it was the way they ran it was the equivalent of, the mob. So that's my suggestion in that article. I'm happy to, if you want questions about either of my articles, I'm happy to send them to you. And that's all I have. Thank you for your attention. This I actually have in my door in my office for my students to see that. I don't know if Einstein really said that, but I certainly like it.
I think we should leave him up.
Okay. All right.
Let's chat.
All right.
So the first thing, do you want microphones or no microphones? Oh, John, you want me? Okay.
John,
Yes.
is that a guess?
Yes.
All right.
Okay.
I think this one is on.
Yeah.
Yes.
And then where's the other one? Oh, yeah.
This one's for you, Rhonda.
Thank you so much. It is on.
Got it. Thank
Okay. All I have to say is I've obviously been going to the wrong conferences because I get like a bookmark or something. I'm not getting any opioids.
Yeah,
so.
but you still have your job, and that's what's important.
I just have to say this presentation really aggravates me. It really makes me angry.
Yes.
So
As it should.
you did a good job.
Thank you.
Thank you. So we're going to have a little chat, a few questions and answers, and then we will open it up to any questions and answers from you guys, or any questions from you guys. So first question is, in pushing for a federal approach, how do you imagine state courts will react? Because as you've said, states vary from state to state, coast to coast.
I actually think states will be relieved that the federal government has come in, and maybe I'm not Pollyanna about this, but the federal government has come in with a framework that is effective. So for example, the federal government with Dr. Sang didn't do anything because they wanted the state to take the lead. And having something that's uniform will make it easier for them to carry out whatever initiatives they have. And the thing about my writing is, in both of the pieces, I'm not suggesting supplanting the CSA or even the state laws. I am saying that this should be added to the mix, to the toolbox, so that there's some consistent way to hold people to account. And I really do think that, you know, when I've talked to folks that are in the legislature, that they would have welcomed something like this.
Yeah, yeah. I think obviously clarity.
Clarity's better.
Yes, it makes life easy. And also, a quick question: where does codeine? I mean, you know, where does that fall in all of this?
Codeine is a Schedule 2 also.
Okay.
So it is one that has, codeine is a molecule of both. I think codeine is, now you're really testing my knowledge.
Sorry.
No, that's okay. Codeine is a molecule of an opioid derivative that I can't remember now. And it is a mixture of, it can be mixed with either an aspirin base or a acetaminophen base.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. So where else has the implied malice approach that you suggest been applied? So in addition to the EMT example given, how have there been other similar shifts in prosecution methods?
Right. So that's a really great question. So this particular approach to implied malice that I'm suggesting hasn't been really used in any space other than, as I talk about in my piece, EMTs, law enforcement, nurses, medical professionals. It's applied to those folks when they are, for example, in car accidents, where they're driving under the influence. They will be held to the second degree implied malice standard because they are held to know what it means to be under the influence and injured in one of those accidents because of their professional exposure. So that's where it came from. It is now actually morphed into something much larger. So now, for example, this is a cautionary tale for the pub, but when if you are a licensed California driver and you are in an accident and you are under the influence and somebody dies, you can be charged with second-degree murder under this implied malice standard. And what they're going to use as proof that you knew is your driver's license form, in which you signed and said that, you know, if you drink or if you drive when you're under the influence of a controlled substance and somebody dies, you can be charged with murder.
And what about the alcohol dispenser, like the barkeep or something like that? Are they responsible?
Not in a criminal context unless they do something additional, but it's not. There are secondary host liabilities. That's usually civil law.
Okay.
Right. So like, you know, people have big parties, people leave their house, somebody's killed. I imagine that there have been criminal cases based on that conduct, but that it's usually a civil remedy.
Okay. So as we did talk for a second about Dr. Conrad Murray and the Michael Jackson case, and he did serve 2 years in prison. And you did mention that this was rare, but was this mostly because he was cause célèbre?
No, interesting. Conrad Murray is a case study and a poster child for someone who took their medical license and sold it to the highest bidder, who was Michael Jackson. He was paid $150,000 a week. He only worked 2 weeks though. So when you read the Conrad Murray case, what you see is this is an individual who is prescribing propofol, which should, under even the most off-label use, is only in a hospital, in an operating room. It's an anesthetic, right? And so he was giving Michael Jackson this anesthetic, just liberally, and not staying in the room and monitoring his vitals. So your question is, why isn't he charged with second-degree murder? Right? Good question. I think the answer lay in the fact that he was a celebrity. And at the time the Conrad Murray case arose, I think that the prosecutor's office here in Los Angeles, which isn't anything if not political, was concerned about getting a conviction. And it's much easier to get a conviction for voluntary manslaughter than it is for implied malice murder. Because remember, with voluntary manslaughter, all you have to show is the person is indifferent to the outcome. It's negligence. Really easy to show. So the kind of evidence you put on for that kind of a trial is you put on doctors who say that his conduct was outside the norm in the standard of medical practice. That's a negligence case. Those kinds of witnesses could never be brought in to a second-degree murder case because that's all based on your subjective awareness, your subjective intent, your subjective knowledge. So I think the prosecutor, and I never have asked this individual, but I think their choice, their discretionary choice was to charge a little bit lower so they could get a conviction.
And they couldn't prove that he knew it was dangerous because all the pharmaceutical companies said it's not dangerous.
Propofol is a different narcotic. I don't
okay.
really know what the labeling, I don't even know who makes it, frankly. I don't know what the labeling and packaging is for that.
Okay.
I mean, I actually think they could have secured that conviction. I just think they didn't want to risk. And also, most of the convictions are for folks like Dr. Sang, where you have multiple deaths.
Yeah.
So that sort of accumulates on itself.
Yeah. I noticed on your chart also that it said more women died than men.
No, more
men died than women.
Yes.
Yeah. Any reason?
I have a theory. It's unproven. I think women handle pain better than men. Sorry. I don't know. I'm making that up.
They're smarter.
That's
than
just something I tell myself. I don't know about smarts, but I know. No, I don't know. I don't know the answer for that. I don't know. I mean, I don't know if it's interesting because men are less likely to access healthcare anyway. So it's interesting that it would affect men more.
Yeah.
Although one thing I didn't note, which is true, is that the marketing for opioids was so pervasive that for a period of time, the number one prescribers of opioids were dentists for oral surgeries and those sorts of things. So it really, that hits everybody.
Everybody hates to go to the dentist.
Right. But if you're leaving with a bottle of 80 milligram Oxycodone, which has a street value of $100 a pill, I don't know.
Wow. Aggravates
I
me
know.
so much. So how is it possible that so many medical decisions could be based on a short article like the Porter and Jick one that appeared, as you noted, in the New England Journal? And as a librarian, I find it amazing that sources weren't checked and rechecked.
Yeah. So why did that happen? It seems from the stance of 2022, it seems odd, but you have to put yourself back into 1980. Pre-internet, pre everything we know now as the ability for even average folks to fact check. And what happened though also is that in that moment in time, you had a medical education system where they were not being educated about pain treatments or narcotics or opioids in any sophisticated way. So they didn't have the sophistication to be able to discern what they were seeing, and they didn't look. They also relied quite heavily about the representations of the FDA. So the doctors are saying, hey, it says this, New England Journal of Medicine, FDA said it's okay, we're going to rely on you. And the scene that I showed from Dope Sick is really, that's what it looked like, right? Busy doctors come in, they offer something that you say, I don't know, but it says that, let's go from there. And then the other thing that I want to add to that answer is that when the war on drugs began, which actually began in the 1960s with LSD, right? There was all this great research into the value, the medical value of psilocybin and LSD and all of the things that could be done that were positive with these drugs that ended in the 1960s during the war on drugs and during the hippie era and all the civil unrest. The federal government said, we are not going to invest public dollars in research for drugs anymore. And they turned that spigot off, and then they turned on the spigot for law enforcement. And without countervailing studies on these drugs, the pharmaceutical industry stepped into the void and they ran their own. And so there was nothing for doctors to compare it to. I know it's hard to believe, but that's the era that they lived in. There was no countervailing voice for them to compare it against.
Okay, I'll let that one go. How has the internet affected patients' demands? I know everybody goes now to their doctors and said, I've done my research. I know this, this, and this. And
I can say this because I'm not a doctor. Doctors hate the internet.
Yes, they do.
but I think what the internet does really well in this space is it does give us information so that if you get an ad, so the ads I showed before, the Oxycodone ad and then one of the woman making breakfast, right? Before the internet, there would be no way for you to like test that on your own to say, really, will that help me make a better, faster breakfast? And will I look like that? Now you can test that. You can test that by searching these drugs on the internet. You
Yeah.
can read all kinds of things. And
Reviews.
this is an instance where I think more speech is better. And I'm not a doctor, so I can say that.
Yeah. No, I think that's true. So the current issue of People magazine, my Bible, I opened it up the other day and there was this great article called The Faces of the Fentanyl Epidemic. And they say that each day, 20 people ages 10 to 24 die from overdoses, 75% of them fentanyl related. It is also the age group most likely to buy drugs online. So the question is, it's one thing to make pharmaceutical companies and doctors accountable, but with online trafficking and drugs that you can just buy on the street, how do we make those people accountable?
Yeah, so this is something that might make you feel a little bit better. I don't know. But that's the CSA actually covers that. This is the conduct that they're engaging in online is clearly squarely in the wheelhouse of the CSA, and it is illegal.
Okay.
So the question is not about creating a new law there, but enforcement.
Right.
And providing the resources to enforce the laws on the books that are in place for this. And it's difficult, but it's something that I'm not as worried about creating a new framework for that.
Right. Okay. And I was thinking when you were talking about opium at the beginning, it's like, I remember all my history is that opium started in the Chinese den.
The opium worms.
Yes.
War of, yes.
And but it was always for kind of like as a muse, as inspiration. That's why people took opium. But when did it then become
a problem? It was a problem
or
then.
not a problem. When did it become more for pain relief versus a high,
Right. I think that the first known use for example, everything from, the respiratory ailments to, menstrual cramps, that really happened in the 1850s through the early 1900s after the Civil War. Then it was used as something, especially on the battlefield. So the Civil War is the first war that people actually survived.
Yeah.
And that they came off of the battlefield with horrendous wounds, but because of battlefield surgery, which was developed in that time period, and the hypodermic needle, and I can go on and on. This history is so interesting to me. But that was where it was first beginning to be prescribed as something that would address people's genuine pain.
Interesting. All right. I want to open it up to questions from our audience now. Because I feel like I need to go take some Valium right now. So do we have any questions from the audience? I see, let's start with you first. And let me come and let's see if I can get to you.
So my questions, I have two, and they actually go directly off of what you were just talking about. And I was fascinated when thinking about the relationship between the development of like opioid derived medications and wartime and soldiers, and how you said at the very beginning that such a big percentage of users today are veterans. Multiple questions. First, could you perhaps speak a little bit more about that in our current environment? And then my secondary question is, in thinking about the ability to persecute and hold people accountable, are there different legal frameworks when there's a military physician versus a civilian physician prescribing to patients?
So I'll answer the first question, the second question first, because it's the easier one. There aren't any. I mean, there are military justice courts, and there are certain forms of conduct that I imagine if you prescribed opioids as a doctor and we're doing it in an unauthorized way, that you could suffer the consequences. But typically that kind of punishment would be turned over to the civil authorities. Though I would imagine, I don't know, I'm not a military historian. I imagine if you end up being prosecuted by a civil authority, that will then impact your status in the military as well. But there aren't different standards. Then to go to your first question, it is interesting to see the connection between war and conflict and the use of opioids. What they have found is, we've lived through a generation of folks, beginning with 9/11 all the way up until extremely recently, where we have, hundreds of thousands of young men and women who have had injuries on the battlefield or associated injuries, who have come back and have been treated with opioids, some in a controlled way, others in a way that more like what's happened with civilians, where they leave with a bottle of pills. What they have found is because of the Veterans Administration and how willing they've been to pay for prescriptions and pay for healthcare, that the problem has exacerbated their problem. And I think it's like more than 25% of veterans who have suffered an injury have opioid abuse use disorder. So it's very, very high, and it's very sad because they've already suffered so many other horrors associated with being in the military. It's a horrible problem.
Thank you. Other questions? This one in the back.
So I was wondering, are there any cases since People versus Dr. Sang that have used that case as precedent? Or
No.
if not, like what type of legal precedent do you think that that's going to set for future cases?
You know, it's interesting. The case created, there's a, you can look on the internet. If you search up her name, you'll see there was a show on Oxygen that they did, a true crime kind of a show about her. And it was interesting to sort of watch that show because they talked about like what a strange situation that was. And as far as I'm aware, there haven't been similar prosecutions by the state of California yet. Right. What's interesting is one of the things I learned from watching that show was that the investigators found that there were more than 20 physicians in the Orange County area that had multiple deaths from opioid prescriptions at the same time. And one physician had 17 patients who died of overdoses. And yet she was the only one that they went forward with. It's interesting. These cases are inherently hard to prove, but part of the purpose of prosecuting in this vigorous way is to also sort of shine a light on and try to correct some of the behaviors that caused this in the first place. But there really haven't been any other cases. I'm watching. Not yet.
Thank you. I was just wondering if there's been any traction with your suggestions and your thoughtful analysis of the value of a federal law. I mean, I realize there's a lot going on in the federal government these days, but I'm just wondering if there is what do I want to say, an advocacy group or or particular people in Congress who are concerned about these issues, who are advocating for a law like the law that you are recommending.
For sure, yes. And you know what, I neglected to mention that, in the last, really at the time when my second article came out, and part of that I reflect on some of the development since. So there have been a number of initiatives at the federal level to sort of rein in aspects of this conduct. For example, now legally, pharmaceutical companies actually have to track prescriptions, and that way you can see who, at one point in downtown LA, there was a pill mill where there were 300,000 pills going to this one location over like a 2-year period. And the only people who knew? Purdue Pharma. They were the only people, and they were not required to tell the federal government. So there's new laws in place in that space. And there's some other laws as well that are addressing treatment initiatives and trying to sort of close the loop on some of this conduct from pharmaceutical companies. There are a number of members of the House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate who are interested in these issues. Unfortunately, right at both of my articles came out during the pandemic, but I sent drafts to various legislators, and I followed up, but I have not yet gotten any traction with it yet, and in part because of the reason that you suggest in your question, which is that there's so much more on their plate that a constituent hasn't brought it forward. It's amazing. Part of my work is trying to find the right constituent to go forward, because I'm just some law professor in California. What do I know? But if I had a constituent group, then, and I'm looking. So.
What about the American Bar Association?
We should invite people.
Okay.
So it's really interesting that you mention her, right? So the only criminal statute of any moment that was passed during the Trump administration was spearheaded by Kim Kardashian. Right. And in my second article, I talk about using the methods that she used to get that to be to pass. And just, and because I know we're going to stop, but
Uh-huh.
the method that they used, so, and I think it's so effective, was that they reframed the problem, right? They reframed it as, something not as about criminals and victims, but reframe the problem to reflect the impact on society writ large. And part of my suggestion for the opioid crisis is really reframing it as an economic problem. We've called it a public health
Yeah.
problem for years. Nobody cares.
Yeah.
Right.
yeah.
But if you talk about it being an economic bread and butter problem, people seem to understand that more than anything else.
Yeah.
And that's nonpartisan. But
Yeah.
I have a lot of ideas in my other article about that.
Thank you so very much. This is such a fascinating topic, and as I said, it's very frustrating at least. I'm sure we can all agree that your research and your proposals. By the way, the acronyms for your proposals.
It's Mama and Papa. That's my acronym. I work very hard to do acronyms.
Yeah, I wondered if there
right.
was any reasoning in that.
Yeah, you're
but-
right. Yeah.
But anyways, I do hope that they do make an impact,
Thank you.
and that it helps us make a giant step forward towards making a difference.
Yeah, thank you so much.
So as we wrap up another fascinating and inspiring year of Faculty Pub Night, we of course want to thank our Dean, Christine Brancolini, for her continued support of the Hannon Library's fabulous programming. And last but not least, I would like to let you know that next week, April 19th, next Tuesday, our next Faculty Pub Night is about plant-derived drug discovery in an introductory biology laboratory course. So
Is
please.
it about opium? I'll come back.
We'll find out, yeah. And please, again, the small little paper there that will help us with future programming, please fill it out. But more importantly, please help yourself to some food and drink.
And thank you, everyone,
Thank
for
you
coming. I
so very
appreciate your
much.
attention. Thank you.